Hi everyone, this is Mr. Trevor. Today we are going to start learning about acrylic painting, and so before we start we need to get a few things in order. So there are certain materials that you will need for these exercises and painting assignments. So first of all, we will have to have a set of acrylic paints. So some of you would have this brand, okay, some of you would have this. Both are fine, okay, so you can use either one, whichever you have. Next we will need to have a pallet, okay. So the pallet is made up of 6 big reservoirs and then a few 7 of the smaller reservoirs in the center here. Okay, so you're going to make use of that to contain and squeeze out your paints. Next we need to have a container of water. Okay, typically I'll fill it up about half. Okay, any random water container is fine. You can use reuse some plastic containers, or it can be a glass one also. Next you also need to have a towel or a piece of cloth that you can use to clean or dry your brushes. So with regard to brushes, you should have 2 different sets of brushes. Okay, so we have the round tip brush that is not so quite rounded at the tips, but maybe if it's rounded if you look at it at this perspective. Okay, but they are mainly very pointed tips for you to utilize them to paint the small details, paint lines for you to do quick sketches with these brushes. And of course it comes with in 3 different sizes. Okay, over here if you bought the standard set, you should have 4, 8 and 12. If you don't have all 3, it's fine, don't worry, just make use with with what you have. Okay, next we have a set of round tip brushes. Okay, so also come in 3 different sizes, 4, 8 and 12. Okay, so the flat tip brushes are kind of square in the tips. Okay, so these are good for painting large areas, bigger surface areas, and they can be good for blending straight lines also. Okay, so these brushes are new, so you will probably need to wet them a little bit with the water before the bristles. Okay, these little hairs here are also called bristles. Before all these bristles become softened. Okay, so over here you see there's a size 8 one is not so soft, so you need to wet them to soften the bristles. Okay, so alright, so brushes aside, okay, you can just put them aside first. You will need to have this worksheet that was given out earlier on. Okay, that's printed on a drawing block. Alright, so if you didn't receive this, you should try to take out a piece of blank drawing block that's about A4 sized. Okay, if you do not have drawing block at home, you can use any blank piece of paper, just that the paper might be a little bit thinner and might not be able to take wet medium so well, so it might crumple a little bit. Okay, so before we begin, we will choose one set of paints. Okay, so over here I will probably be using this set most of the time. Okay, so just take out the paints. Now some of you might find that the paints are new, so in order for you to take out the paints, okay, right, it's now still sealed. Okay, you can see that you can't squeeze out anything. Right, so at the tip of the cover of this cap here, okay, open up the cap, there is a needle in the center there. Okay, just flip the cap over, okay, to use the needle inside there to poke open this tube of paint. Okay, so once you poke it through, the tube of paint should be accessible. Okay, so for this exercise, let's try to pick out for this brand, we will take out this primary cyan color. Okay, if you are using the Omni set, there is no need to poke open the tube of paints. If you are using this Omni set, you can pick up this blue shade. Okay, this shade of blue that you can use. For this, you won't have to poke open any of the paints, so it should be usable. Okay, now so regarding the palette, okay, like I mentioned before, there are the smaller reservoirs here and the bigger ones. Okay, so typically we will squeeze out some bit of paint. Okay, maybe about a 5 cents sized block of paint. in one of the middle smaller reservoirs here. Okay, so set it aside and then cap back your acrylic paint. Now, for us to be using the brushes, okay, let's talk about how you should be holding the brushes first. Okay, you should, like your pencils, previously I taught you before, you should be holding your pencils and brushes with only 3 fingers. Okay, you just need the middle finger, the index finger, and your thumb. So these 3 fingers can control all your movements and your painting or your drawing if you are using pencils. Okay, so like mentioned before, the brushes are still very stiff right here. Okay, you just soak it into the water, okay, and try to brush it against the bottom of the water container. Once it's gotten wet and absorbed some water, it should become soft. Okay, so dry it a little bit on the cloth. So you see it has already softened, so you can bend it here and there, and it's more flexible. Okay, so for this exercise, what we need to try to do and achieve is to paint lines of different thickness, and you may use different size brushes to achieve different thickness. You should also observe the thickness and wetness of the paints. Observe and ask yourself, how wet should the paints be on the brush in order to maintain a consistently thick and rich color throughout the line from start to end. Okay, so for acrylic paints, unlike watercolor or poster colors that you might have been using in primary school, the paints have to be relatively thick, okay, and not so diluted with water. Okay, I'm going to show you on my rough piece of paper what I mean by too thin and too diluted. Okay, so on my rough piece of paper, okay, so on my rough piece of paper, okay, so on my rough piece of paper, I'm going to show you what I mean by too diluted. Okay, so using the round tip brush, I'm using a size 12 brush. What I mean by too watery will be when you paint the line like that, okay, and you can see through the paints. You can see through the paints until like you can see what's underneath the paint, and you can see through onto the drawing block. So this is definitely too thin and too diluted. This is more like a watercolor technique, which is not correct when we are using acrylic paint. Okay, so how thick should it be? Acrylic paints, you must use it rather thickly. So when I pick up a little bit of paints, it should be about this thick. Okay, it coats the entire tip of the brush. Okay, glistening, kind of looking rather wet, quite glossy. Okay, so when you paint it, it should be nice and thick, and it shouldn't be seeing through the paints. Okay, so when you spread it out a little bit more, it gets thinner, then you can see through. But it should be nice, solid, and thick. Okay, true to the richness of the color itself. Okay, so it should be nice and deep. Okay, so if I bring it closer to the camera, it should be about this thickness. Okay, so it's rather wet, rather thick, and very glossy, deep and rich in color. Okay, so when we move on to the actual exercise on the templated worksheet, your painting should be very thick like that. Okay, so if you can see, rather thick, very rich in color, and not like that. Okay, I repeat, not like that. When you put in a lot of water, and then you can see through, okay, the paint itself onto the drawing block. Okay, so I'm going to rinse my brush. So when I'm rinsing my brush, I will brush it at the bottom of the water container, okay, according to the flow and direction of the bristles itself, so that you don't spoil the brush. Okay, so I'm going to set this rough paper aside and go back to the worksheet. Now, so for the first section, we're going to use the round tip brush, okay, like what I was using just now, to create nice solid lines. Okay, so the brush should be relatively wet, okay, but not dripping wet. So that's why we need, after we rinse the brushes, you need to use the rag, okay, to kind of dry and get off excess water. Okay, so try to brush it. Okay, when you rinse it, the excess water, just briefly dry it with the cloth. Okay, then okay, since we're using only one color, okay, we're not mixing color, so you can actually just directly take the paint from the center reservoir here. Okay, so just briefly coat this brush, the tip of the brush, with a nice coat of paint. Also, by now your paint shouldn't be too dry yet. Okay, so from left to right, okay, depending on your left-hander or right-hander. I'm right-hander, so I'll just be painting from left to right. Okay, just try to draw paint lines from left to right. Okay, just as per our exercises for pencil, we are drawing creating straight lines. Okay, so that was one line. Okay, the paint was not too consistent, if you can see. Okay, bring it up here. Okay, it's one straight line, but of course there's differing thickness of the paint. Okay, so I decided maybe I should grab more paints, okay, a little bit more, so that I can paint maybe something more consistent throughout the line. Okay, left to right. Okay, so you'll notice that the thickness has also differed because I press a little bit harder. When you press a little bit harder, okay, the brush will bend and it kind of spreads, the bristles will spread out a little bit more, such that there's a larger surface area covered when it touches the paper. So that's how you can achieve thicker lines. Okay, so press a little bit harder. Okay, so you see the paint will start to get thinner towards the end of the line. Okay, so you can see the paint was wet enough to be having a rather solid line, but then it's just that it might have gotten a little bit thinner towards the end. Okay, so observe and see how much paint and how wet the paint should be when you are picking it out from the palette. Okay, so we just continue to practice painting straight lines, solid lines that are dark enough. And of course, if you want, you can switch brushes to use a smaller sized round tip brush. This is the smallest one that I have in the set. Okay, that is about this is a size 4. Okay, so similarly, rinse it, soften the bristles first, dry it on the rag, and we can pick up the paints again. Okay, so there's a coat of paint on it, and with the smallest size brush here that we have, you should be able to create very thin lines. Okay, now you see that the line is kind of a bit, it comes in blobs, okay, because the paints might have been too thick. So there's too much paint on the brush tip, so it becomes a little bit inconsistent in the distribution of the paint. Now, so we try to make it thinner, okay, less paint, but which means when the brush can hold lesser paint, you probably need to keep taking more paint, and it cannot sustain throughout the whole line. So maybe you paint halfway, okay, then take more paint, then you continue. Okay, so that you can continue to have a long, nice line. Okay, so feel free to explore within this area with your round tip brush. Within the available space, you might also want to create some curvy lines. Okay, like what we have learned using pencil, we can try to create some form of this line weight. Okay, so from thick to thin. Okay, within one line itself, one stroke, you can create a line that is from thick, okay, to thin. So we can also apply line weight here using brushes. So when you press down harder, the line will get thicker, and you lift it up a little bit more, the line gets thinner. I'm running out of paint here, so let's try that again. I'll take more paint. Okay, so you can apply hard, press it down, lift it up a bit lighter, and then the line will get thinner. Okay, so you can see maybe the paint's getting a little bit dry, so we get a little bit more water. Thick to thin. Okay, so you can try to do some curvy lines and apply a line weight to it. Right, so explore, but I should continue to see clear lines, be thick or thin, or straight or curvy lines. So every line should be clearly demonstrated so that I can take a look at your control of your round tip brush in painting lines. Okay, so what we're trying to achieve in this exercise is for you to observe how much paint you should get to maintain a clean edge. Okay, lines of clean edges. So examples of non clean edges will be all this. Okay, the lines that are a little bit fuzzy, not so clean, not so clear. Okay, so we need to learn to control the wetness of the paint to get clean edged lines. Okay, it shouldn't be fuzzy, it shouldn't be furry, it shouldn't be blurry looking. Okay, so this will be the first exercise for today. Try to play around with the different size brushes for round tip. Okay, so we're going to move on to the flat tip brush, okay, for the second part of this worksheet. Okay, exercise number 2. Because there's a limited space here, so I won't be using the size 12 flat tip brush. I'll be using the medium size, which is size 8 over here. So same thing, this is a brand new brush, so it's a little bit stiff, so I'm going to soften it in the water. Okay, let it be wet, and so that the bristles can be softened like that. Okay, so now that is soft. Okay, so try it a little bit, and if you want to change the color of the paint, if you want, you can, but I'm trying to not waste the paint, so I'm going to make use of whatever we have already squeezed out here. If you want to change your color, you want to have a variety of color for this worksheet, you can. Okay, so same thing, using the flat tip brush, you can paint a straight line. Okay, so of course, when you take a look here, because the flat tip brush will spread the paint out across a larger surface area, so the paint gets thin. Okay, it gets thinned out very quickly, so you might have to use we can afford to take more paint on the tip of the brush. Okay, so very lightly let the brush hover over the paper so that you are not pressing down too hard, and such that you will spread the paint too thin. Okay, so both sides of the brushes will get the paint. So when you're painting, consider using both sides of the brush. Okay, so it's like a piece of bread, okay, with kaya on both sides. Okay, or maybe a knife that you're trying to spread the kaya over the bread. So once one side has exhausted the paint, you can turn, okay, rotate it around to continue painting from the other side using the paint on the other side of the brush. Alright, so this is one solid line using the flat tip brush. Now the flat tip brush can be used, okay, using this side so that you can have a nice thick line, correct? Okay, or you can flip it around and use the thin side to create thin lines. Okay, this is how you're going to go about doing it. Okay, we'll take more paint. So we're using the thin part of this, okay, to do it this way, such that you can have a nice thin line as well. Okay, so I'm still using the same brush, same size brush, size 8, right? Okay, but I can create both the thick line that we have created just now, and also to create thin line by painting it horizontally like that. Okay, so I'm just using this shape of the brush to do it this way. Okay, the other thing that you can try to do, it will be to create different thickness based on the size of the brush. Okay, what you can do is kind of doing a zigzag line here, but like earlier on I was doing the thin line, so I'm going to use this. Okay, but not turning, not rotating the paper. Okay, I can not rotating the brush. Okay, I can create this thin line, but not rotating the brush. I can do a zigzag line to have a thick line like that. Okay, so the zigzag line. Okay, thin, thick, thin, thick, thin, and thick. Okay, so you can create lines like that. Okay, of course, like I mentioned, the paint runs out very quickly due to the large surface area that the flat-tip brush covers. Okay, so you can get a little bit more paint. Okay, so we can do the thin, continue with the line, the thin line. Okay, thick, thin, thick, thin, thick, thin, thick. Okay, so you can create a zigzag line of thin and thick sections along the way. Okay, so of course when you do it in a curvy manner, okay, I'm just going to make use of the additional space that we have underneath here. So I start off with thick, and then when you move it, you should be able to get different thickness along the way. Okay, so now the paint is too watery. Okay, I'm going to take more paint. Okay, coat the tip of the brush with a relatively thick layer of paint, and we can do this again, go over so that the color is solid, the line is solid, and we have rather clean edges along on the outside of the lines. Okay, so that is a clear straight, not straight, I mean clear line. Okay, so it's not fuzzy, it's not hairy at the edges like that. Okay, so for this whole exercise, okay, for this whole worksheet, your objective is to play around with the brushes and the paint. Okay, so with the brushes, you need to know how to control the brush. Okay, using only 3 fingers. Okay, to control and move your brush. How you control the brushes to get straight lines and uniform lines. Okay, and curvy lines. And also for you to experience and observe how thick, how much paint you should be putting on to your brush, and how wet the paint should be to maintain consistency throughout the line and to make it rich and solid. Okay, so you can understand the nature of acrylic paint better. Okay, it should all be consistent, and this section is the wrong demonstration whereby the paint is too thin, is too diluted, and too wet. Okay, so it becomes like a watercolor translucent kind of effect here. Okay, so key points: control your brush, the different effects the brushes that can create. Okay, and the consistency and thickness and wetness of the paint itself. So okay, once you have completed these 2 sections of this worksheet, you can let it dry, take a photo of it, and submit for assessment.